Welcome to the Learning Series, where the power of understanding helps you make better decisions. Today I'm going to talk with you about special education secrets, in particular, the difference between private versus public schools. There's always a lot of questions about this, and what does it really mean for students that may have different types of abilities and disabilities. So we're going to walk through kind of the top 8 questions that I've seen. So first, are private schools that much better? Well, there are 2 types of private schools that I'll talk about here. First are small, independently funded private schools that may not have many students. Sometimes they're run by charitable organizations. Sometimes they're started by a handful of parents. And so I'm going to talk about that type. And those types of schools really struggle with resources. And when I talk about resources, I talk about from furniture to paying the rent in the building to getting access to service providers. It can be a real handful compared to public schools. And public schools are taxpayer supported, etc. So the private schools, in the smaller context that I just mentioned here, can really be challenging at times. But what I will say, and I'm going to talk about later in this session, is that they have a culture that can be amazingly powerful and embracing for students because everyone who works there is on the same page. And that accepting culture and we're all in this together mentality can be very, very powerful that you don't always see in larger public schools. The other type of private school are those that are funded by private foundations, or they get private foundations, and or they might specialize in focus areas, such as we work with students that have autism, or we just focus on students that have behavior disorders. So those that are privately funded through foundations and they have large endowments can really take on more of a feeling of like a boarding school. Sometimes they will be a boarding school versus just day programs like most traditional public schools. But are private schools that much better? Typically, I would say no for a student that has more significant types of disabilities in particular, because public schools provide just many more resources. Occupational therapists, physical therapists, behavior consultants, speech consultants, trained special ed teachers. Some of the private schools, they may not even be able to have on staff even a certified special ed teacher. They might have teachers that are certified in general ed. You have some private schools that don't have certified teachers. Nothing wrong with those schools. Some of them do a wonderful job. But in the sense of are private schools that much better? I typically say no for most students that are in special education. Public schools just have many more resources. But I'm going to talk through, as I just mentioned, the culture can be really powerful when everyone's on the same page as far as staffing. Next, do public schools have private-like schools? So this one really deals with the concept of, is there a kind of a in public systems, are there these specialized kind of schools? Typically not. The best example I can think of is like a public traditional school where they wear uniforms, they have to apply to the school, they have certain standards. So that might be considered more of a private-like school. But those really aren't geared towards students that have learning differences. The other kind of private-like school, there are not many of these left, but that might be a special school that serves just students with really severe disabilities. There are not many of those left. Back in the 70s and 80s, public schools really moved toward mainstreaming, which meant students that had really severe disabilities being served in their local school rather than bus to these special schools that have a lot of students just with disabilities. They wanted to be around more typical like peers. So there are a few of these special schools, typically only in large urban districts. And primarily it's just for students that might have really involved disabilities, have heart conditions, feeding tubes, severe cognitive disabilities, cerebral palsy, where they have full-time nursing staff, multiple nurses on staff, full-time physical therapy, full-time occupational therapists, etc. Next one is, what are private treatment or special schools like? Well, I talked about that a little bit. Private treatment center or special schools, what they center on is a specific type of student, and that can be really powerful. Versus in public schools, you have to serve all students that come. So you have general education staff, you have special education staff, you have regular activities going on with non-disabled students, athletics, etc. That students that have special needs, special gifts, or disabilities are allowed to participate in as well. Some of the private schools or treatment centers, they're not going to have these kind of things. They're going to be much more targeted. Typically, they're a smaller population, but they also focus in on that type of student's disability. So you might have a treatment center that focuses just on, let's say, students that have a drug or alcohol problem. And they'll go to that center, that private treatment center or school, and they'll get treatment for their disability focused on, let's say, a school for students with autism. They'll have a program developed just for students that have autism. And they'll also have a classrooms setting or a school setting there too, that they'll also be able to go through and receive their instruction, as well as extra services that are focused just on that type of disability. So you can, in these private treatment or special schools, there's really a focus on the individual students and who all have that similar type disability. And it goes on, number 4 there, the staffing ratios. Typically, there's a much better staffing ratio because you have smaller numbers of students. And so the staffing ratios, you might have a teacher and 2 aides in a class of 10 students, for example. Now, again, there are trade-offs with this. If it's a private school, then you're going to have a significant tuition cost. Some of them are covered by insurance, but very rare. That's why these private schools, if you will, that focus on one type of student, students that have one type of disability, they may not always have certified teachers. But anyway, they do have a powerful culture, and usually their staffing ratios are better than in a public school where you might have 30 students in a classroom. But those 30 kids, most are going to be general education students, and you only have a handful of special ed students typically who are blended in the regular traditional mainstream classes in a public school. So that goes on to number 5, talking about this whole culture. I'm going to talk about a culture focused on a specific type of student is a huge, huge strength. And I think this is really what private schools or treatment centers really bring to the mix that public schools really just can't compete with. Everyone's there for the same reason. The staff, the janitors, the principals. In these private schools, they all know what they're getting into. Most of them have a personal reason for being there. They might have a student themselves, a child themselves who's a student that has this type of disability. There might be a grandparent that had a grandchild. It matters not. I've seen it all. To come to work at that school, you have a like-minded approach, and you want to be there because typically they're not paying as well as public schools are paying either. And so, yes, there is a tuition cost. Some private schools, though, their tuition cost is not outlandish. And if parents are looking for one that can really help their child and all the teachers are on the same page, a lot of parents are willing to make that sacrifice. Next one here, most public schools have better resources compared to most privates. And that's just the truth. And that's what I've said earlier. You've got, at a public school, there's no charge, and if your child's identified as having a disability and they're able, based on that disability, to need specialized services, then public schools, they're required to offer them in their special education program. And it can vary from school psychologists to a psychoeducational assessment to occupational physical therapists, etc. It's just a wealth of resources there in the public schools, free of charge. Next, residential versus day programs. Some of these private schools are residential and they stay overnight. I think about most states have schools for the deaf or visually impaired. A lot of these schools are still residential treatment programs or residential schools where they go for the week and come home on weekends. But there are not many residential programs left. The specialized schools, most of them for students that have disabilities, most of them are day programs where you drop them off and pick them up. And I've known people to drive 70 miles one way to drop their children off, and they'll stay there in town for the day and then pick them up after school and take them home 70 miles. Again, we go a long way for our children, no doubt. And then quality of staff. In the public schools, you have to have a certified degree in most cases to be a special education teacher. You're going to have school psychologists certified. You're going to have speech therapists, etc. They're trained. In private schools, that might not be the case, especially with these specialists that I just mentioned, because they're very costly. What I've seen most parents do is they just pay to have these extra services, occupational, physical therapy, etc., on their own after school. So this gives you some idea of kind of some of the secrets there about public versus private schools. And that's going to be a wrap for the day. If you'd like more information, just click the link below.